morning Charles Ashford told his wife she was plain. He said it the way a man might comment on the weather, casually, without looking up from his newspaper, without any awareness that the words might land somewhere inside her and stay there, the way a splinter stays buried beneath the skin long after the wound has closed over it. Eleanor was standing near the window. She had just finished dressing. Her hair was pinned neatly at the back of her neck, and she was wearing a gray dress that she had chosen because it was comfortable, and because gray was a color that asked nothing of anyone. She had been standing there looking out at the street below, watching a horse pull a cart over the wet cobblestones, thinking about nothing in particular, and then Charles said it. "You really are quite plain, Eleanor. I do not know why you bother with the mirror." She did not respond. She turned from the window, picked up her gloves from the chair beside the door, and walked out of the room. Her footsteps made no sound on the thick carpet of the hallway. The house was large and quiet, and full of expensive things that Charles had chosen himself, and Eleanor moved through it every day like a ghost who had learned not to disturb the living. That was the year 1887. Eleanor was 26 years old. She had been married to Lord Charles Ashford for 4 years, and in those 4 years she had learned a great many things that no one had thought to prepare her for. She had learned that a large house could feel smaller than a single room. She had learned that a man could share a table with a woman every morning and evening and still never once look at her properly. She had learned that loneliness did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, like fog, and settled so gradually that by the time you noticed it, you could no longer see your own hands in front of your face. She had grown up in Hampshire, the youngest daughter of a country gentleman named Mr. Arthur Whitmore, who had a modest estate, a warm laugh, and an unfortunate talent for spending money faster than his land could produce it. Her mother, Catherine, had died when Eleanor was 14, and after that the house had lost a quality that Eleanor could never quite name but always felt the absence of. Her father had done his best, which was generous and well-intentioned and not quite enough. By the time Eleanor was 22, the estate was quietly struggling. There were whispers at church about debts. The roof above the east wing had begun to leak. Charles Ashford had come into their lives through the introduction of a mutual acquaintance at a county dinner. He was 41 at the time, a widower with no children, a baronet with a house in Mayfair and land in 3 counties. He was not warm, but he was steady. He was not charming, but he was respectable. He had looked at Eleanor across the dinner table with the careful attention of a man surveying something he was considering acquiring, and within 2 months he had spoken to her father, and within 4 months they were married. Eleanor had not been unhappy on her wedding day. She had not been overjoyed either. She had stood in the small church in the village wearing her mother's altered wedding gown, and felt something that she would later describe to herself as determined. She had decided to make the best of things. She had believed that quiet kindness and careful effort would, in time, build something between them, something warm, something real. She had been wrong. It was not that Charles was cruel in any dramatic way. He did not raise his voice often. He did not strike her. He paid her bills and kept her household running, and appeared with her at the appropriate social occasions. But he treated her as though she were slightly less interesting than his club, and considerably less important than his business affairs. He introduced her at parties after he had already greeted every man in the room. He corrected her at the dinner table in front of guests, small corrections about things that hardly mattered, delivered in the patient tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. He had opinions about her hair and her posture and the way she held her cutlery, and he shared those opinions without invitation. He had never once asked her what she thought about anything. She had discovered, gradually and without drama, that she was invisible inside her own marriage. The house in Mayfair was 4 stories tall and stood on a quiet street lined with plane trees. It had a drawing room with dark green walls and 2 fireplaces that were never quite warm enough in winter. It had a dining room where the table was always set for 2, but often only one end was used. It had a library full of books that Charles never read, and that Eleanor read often, quietly, when he was at his club, or at his offices, or at whatever engagement had taken him away for the evening. She had discovered the library early in their marriage, on a rainy afternoon, when the drawing room felt too large and the bedroom too close. She had pushed open the door and found floor-to-ceiling shelves of old leather-bound volumes, and a deep armchair near the window, and a small lamp that cast a yellow pool of light onto the worn Persian rug. She had sat in that chair and opened a book about the Italian countryside and stayed there for 3 hours without moving, and it was the most peaceful she had felt in months. After that, the library became hers in a way that no other part of the house was. She spent her mornings there when Charles was away. She read about painting and architecture and history and travel. She read novels and poetry and long descriptive letters written by explorers who had sailed to places she would never see. She read with the concentrated attention of a person who had no one to talk to. and had therefore learned to have very rich conversations with books. The household staff knew her as a quiet and considerate employer. Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, had worked for Charles since his first marriage, and was loyal to the house with a fierce practicality that left little room for sentiment. But she was not unkind to Eleanor. She provided what was needed and kept the house running with a military precision that Eleanor had come to rely on, because managing the household gave her something to do, and doing things well gave her a quiet sense of worth that nothing else in her daily life provided. There were two housemaids, Dorothea and Agnes, who were young and sometimes whispery with each other when they thought Eleanor could not hear them, and a cook named Mrs. Fenn who produced perfectly adequate food that Charles usually ate without comment. There was a butler named Graves, who was formal and correct in all things and who addressed Eleanor as "my lady," with an exactness that somehow always made her feel both respected and reduced. Eleanor managed the household accounts. She planned the menus. She accepted calling cards and returned visits, and attended the social occasions that were expected of her. She sat beside Charles at dinners, and smiled at the right moments, and said nothing that would embarrass him. She wore the appropriate gowns and the appropriate expression, and came home afterwards and sat in the quiet of her bedroom and felt the distance between the person she had been at the table and the person sitting alone with her candle. She was not the sort of woman who cried easily. She had learned not to. Crying felt to her like spending money you did not have. You felt briefly lighter and then considerably worse, and nothing around you had changed. What she did instead was think. She thought a great deal during those years. Long, careful thoughts that she kept to herself because there was no one to share them with. She thought about her mother, who had painted watercolors in the afternoons and sung quietly while she worked, and who had always made Eleanor feel, without ever saying so directly, that she was exactly the right person to be. She thought about the years before the marriage, when she had walked across the Hampshire fields in the early morning, and felt the strange and wonderful sense that life was large and full of things she had not yet discovered. She wondered sometimes what had become of that feeling. She wondered what she would have done differently, and then she put the thought away because wondering about the past was a habit that led nowhere comfortable. The one correspondence she maintained with any real feeling was her letters to her older cousin Clara, who lived in Edinburgh with a surgeon husband and 3 noisy children, and a warmth that came through every line she wrote. Clara's letters were long and funny and full of ordinary domestic detail that Eleanor read with something close to longing. Clara asked about her in every letter. "How are you, really? Not how is the house, or how is Charles, or how are the social engagements. How are you really?" Eleanor always wrote back that she was well. It was in the autumn of that year, 1887, that the first thing changed. It was small, unremarkable from the outside. She would not have been able to point to it and say, "There, that was the moment." But looking back on it later, she would understand that it was the beginning. She had gone one afternoon to the house of Lady Fitzwilliam, a woman in her 60s who hosted a monthly afternoon gathering for the wives of her husband's associates. Eleanor attended these gatherings because Charles expected her to, and because they provided a break from the library, and because she had found, over time, that listening to other women talk about their lives was more interesting than people gave it credit for. That afternoon, a woman had arrived late who Eleanor had not seen at these gatherings before. She was perhaps 45, with dark silver-streaked hair and a direct gaze and the kind of self-possession that took up space without apologizing for it. Her name was introduced as Madame Colette Verne, and she was French, and she was an artist. She had been living in London for 3 years, teaching painting from a small atelier she kept in Chelsea. The other women asked her polite questions about her work and then drifted back to their usual conversations, because art was pleasant as a topic but not quite the territory of this particular gathering. Eleanor, however, found herself still standing near Colette after the others had moved away, holding her teacup and not quite ready to leave the conversation. "You paint?" Colette asked her. "My mother did," Eleanor said. "I watched her often when I was young. But you do not yourself." "I have not had the occasion to try." Colette looked at her with a directness that Eleanor found slightly startling. Most people in her social circle looked at her with a certain polite blankness, as though she were a pleasantly neutral background element. Colette was looking at her as though she were something specific. "You should come to my atelier," Colette said. "I teach small groups on Thursday mornings. The work is not about talent, it is about seeing." Eleanor opened her mouth to say something polite and dismissive. She had a small collection of such responses ready at all times, phrases that deflected invitations without offending the person extending them. She had used them so often they came automatically. But she did not say any of them. Instead she said, "What time on Thursdays?" She did not tell Charles. This was not because she was hiding something, or not exactly. It was more that she had learned, over 4 years, That anything she expressed an interest in that Charles had not himself approved was likely to be met with a comment that made her feel small, and she was not ready for that. She wanted to keep this one thing, this small new thing, for herself a little longer. The following Thursday she told Mrs. Holt she was going to visit a friend and took the carriage to Chelsea. The atelier was on the first floor of a narrow building on a street that smelled of paint and coal smoke and the faint sweetness of a bakery somewhere nearby. There was a wooden staircase with a slightly uneven banister, and at the top of it, a door with a small painted sign that said simply, Vern. Eleanor knocked. Colette answered in a paint-stained apron and waved her in without ceremony. The studio was nothing like the drawing rooms Eleanor spent her days in. It was large and bright, with two tall north-facing windows that let in a flat, even light that seemed to have no shadows in it. There were canvases stacked against the walls, some finished, some blank, some in various stages of being neither. There were jars of brushes and pots of paint, and the smell of linseed oil that Eleanor found, to her own surprise, immediately comforting, because it was the same smell that had drifted from her mother's small painting room in Hampshire all those years ago. There were 3 other women in the class that morning. One was older, perhaps 60, who painted flowers with great precision and a slight frown of concentration. One was Eleanor's age, a cheerful woman named Adelaide who said she was terrible at painting but found it relaxing. The third was a quiet young woman named Harriet who said almost nothing but whose brushwork, Eleanor noticed, was quietly extraordinary. Colette set Eleanor up at an easel with a canvas and a small palette of basic colors and told her to paint something she could see in the room. Just that, something she could see. Eleanor looked around the studio. She looked at the jars of brushes, at the window frames, at the angle of light falling across the wooden floorboards. She picked up a brush. She spent the next 2 hours doing something she had not done in years, possibly ever, which was being completely absorbed in a task that had no social function, no household application, and no one watching to see if she was doing it correctly. She was absorbed in looking, in trying to see the exact color of the shadow beneath the jar of brushes, in trying to understand how light changed the color of the wooden floor near the window versus the floor near the wall. She produced something that was not exactly good. It was uncertain and a little timid in its lines. But when Colette came to look at it at the end of the morning, she said something that Eleanor had not heard in a long time. She said, "You have a good eye, you see carefully." Eleanor walked back to the waiting carriage that afternoon, with the smell of linseed oil still faintly on her hands, and something moving quietly in her chest that she did not immediately recognize. It was only later, in the library, with a cup of cooling tea beside her and the gray light of a London afternoon beyond the window, that she realized what it was. It was the feeling that she existed, not as Lord Ashford's wife, not as the woman at the end of the dinner table, not as the quiet figure who managed the household and attended the required gatherings and said the appropriate things and took up the minimum possible amount of room. Just as herself, Eleanor, a person who, it turned out, could see carefully. She went back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Charles noticed nothing. He was in the middle of negotiations over a property in Yorkshire, and was occupied with his solicitor and his business partners most mornings. And in any case, he had never shown particular interest in how Eleanor spent her days. As long as the household ran smoothly and she appeared where she was required to appear, he asked no questions. Eleanor asked Colette on her 4th visit whether she might stay an extra hour to work after the others had left. Colette said yes without making a thing of it, which Eleanor appreciated. She spent that extra hour trying to understand how to paint the color of water in a glass, which turned out to be considerably harder than it appeared and completely absorbing. She began reading books about painting from the library, books about color theory and composition and the history of different painting movements. She read them with the same concentrated attention she had always brought to books, and she began to bring questions to Thursday mornings that made Colette raise an eyebrow in the way that meant she was pleased. Something was changing, not dramatically, not in any way that anyone around her could see. But something was waking up, very slowly, like a plant, pushing up through cold ground, not certain yet of the direction of the light but moving towards it anyway. She did not know yet where it would lead. She did not know that this quiet Thursday ritual would become the thread that would eventually unravel and reweave the entire shape of her life. She did not know that the painting she had begun to work on in secret, a small canvas of winter light falling through the Chelsea atelier window, would become something that a stranger would one day stand in front of and be unable to look away from. She knew only that for 2 hours on Thursday mornings, she was not plain. She was not anything Charles had decided she was. She was simply present, and looking, and alive in a way that she had quietly, without quite realizing it, stopped being. And that, for now, was enough to keep going. She walked into the house on Mayfair that evening to find Charles already at the dinner table, his face arranged in the mild impatience he wore when she had not been present exactly when he expected her. She sat down across from him. She unfolded her napkin. She answered his question about where she had been, with a brief mention of visiting a friend in Chelsea, and he nodded without interest and returned to his own thoughts. She ate her dinner. She said the appropriate things. And inside her, very quietly, something that had been sleeping for a long time, turned over and stretched its arms and opened its eyes. The winter came in hard that year. The streets of Mayfair turned gray with frost, and the plane trees outside the house lost the last of their leaves and stood bare and dignified against a sky the color of old pewter. The coal fires in the drawing room burned steadily but could never quite beat back the chill that came through the tall sash windows, and Eleanor had taken to carrying a small wool shawl with her as she moved about the house, which Charles had commented on once with a slight expression of disapproval, because he considered it inelegant. She had stopped wearing the shawl in rooms where he was likely to see her. In the library, alone, she wore it over her shoulders and tucked her feet beneath her in the chair, and read for hours. The Thursday lessons continued, and with each visit, Eleanor felt the change inside her becoming slightly more solid, more real. It was not a dramatic change. She did not suddenly become a different person. She did not wake up one morning full of fire and certainty. It was quieter than that, and more lasting. It was the change that comes when a person who has been holding themselves very still for a long time begins, slowly and carefully, to move. Colette had noticed something in Eleanor that Eleanor herself had not yet fully seen. She mentioned it one Thursday in January, as Eleanor was working on a study of the view from the atelier window, the rooftops of Chelsea under a pale winter sky. "You paint with restraint," Colette said, standing beside her easel and studying the canvas. "You hold the brush back from what it wants to do." "What does it want to do?" Eleanor asked. Colette considered this. "It wants to be bolder. You can see exactly what is there, but you do not trust yourself to put it down with full confidence. You correct before you have committed." She tapped the corner of the canvas lightly with one finger. "This edge here, you have made it cautious, but the light on that roof was not cautious. It was quite sharp." Eleanor looked at the painting. She looked at the actual rooftop through the window. Colette was right. The light was sharp. She had softened it. "Why do you do that?" Colette asked, not unkindly, genuinely curious, the way a scientist might be curious about an unexpected result. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She turned the question over in her mind. Why did she soften the things that were sharp? Why did she correct before committing? Why, when she felt certain of something, did she pull back at the last moment and make it smaller than it was? She thought she probably knew the answer. She was not quite ready to say it out loud. But she thought about it on the carriage ride home. She thought about it at dinner, while Charles talked about a disagreement he had had with his solicitor. She thought about it in the library that evening, sitting in her armchair with a book open on her lap that she was not reading. She had learned, over 4 years of marriage, that confidence was unwelcome, that having a strong opinion about something was likely to result in Charles explaining patiently why she was mistaken, with the tired air of a man who had not asked for additional conversation. She had learned that being correct about something was more uncomfortable than being wrong, because being correct meant Charles had to find a reason why her correctness was somehow also slightly the wrong kind of correct. She had learned to anticipate his assessments and incorporate them in advance, to make herself smaller before he had the chance to make her feel small. She had been doing it for so long that she now did it automatically. She did it with paint. She did it with words. She did it with the way she stood in rooms and the amount of space she allowed herself to take up. The following Thursday, she came back to the rooftop painting and looked at the cautious edge she had made. She picked up her brush. She mixed a sharper color, and she painted the edge the way it actually was. Sharp, definite, unapologetic. She stood back and looked at it for a long moment. It was better, considerably better. It had a quality the rest of her work had lacked, a quality of being fully present, of not hedging against itself. Colette stood beside her and said nothing for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Just that. Yes." Eleanor took the painting home that Thursday. She wrapped it in brown paper and carried it up to her bedroom and unwrapped it and propped it against the wall below the window and looked at it in the gray afternoon light. It was not a great painting. She had no illusions about that, but it was honest. It was the first thing she had made that was entirely her own, that had no element of correction in advance in it, that had not been shaped by the anticipated disapproval of anyone. She felt something that took her a moment to identify, because it had been absent for long enough that it felt slightly foreign. She felt proud of herself. She did not put the painting anywhere Charles would see it. She put it in the wardrobe behind her summer dresses. But she knew it was there, and the knowledge of it sat quietly in her chest like a small, warm thing. It was the following week that the letter arrived. She almost did not open it. It was addressed in handwriting she did not recognize, with a Paris postmark and a return address she did not know. Letters that arrived addressed to her specifically, rather than to Lord and Lady Ashford, were uncommon enough to be slightly startling. Most of the correspondence that came to the house was for Charles, and anything addressed to both of them was handled by Graves. This one had been placed on the silver tray in the hallway with her name on it, and Graves had left it there without comment, and Eleanor had picked it up on her way to the library and carried it with her and set it on the table beside her chair and looked at it for a few minutes before opening it. The letter was from a woman named Marguerite Fontaine, who identified herself as having been a close friend of Eleanor's mother, Catherine Whitmore, before her marriage. Marguerite wrote in careful, formal English that was occasionally arranged in the French manner, and it took Eleanor a moment to settle into the rhythm of it. She read it twice. Marguerite Fontaine wrote that she had only recently learned of Catherine's death, some years ago now, and had been deeply saddened by the news. She wrote that she had known Catherine when they were both young women in Paris, where Catherine had spent a year studying before returning to England and marrying Eleanor's father. She wrote that Catherine had been one of the most gifted painters she had ever known, and that she had always believed Catherine's talent had deserved more recognition than the life of a country gentleman's wife had allowed. She wrote that she had something she wished to pass to Eleanor, as Catherine's youngest daughter. In the care of a solicitor in Paris, she explained, there was a small amount of money that she had set aside for Catherine years ago, at a time when it was needed and Catherine had refused to take it as charity, and Marguerite had placed it in trust with the intention that it would one day reach Catherine's children. She had not known how to locate Eleanor until a mutual acquaintance had happened to mention her name. The amount was not large. The letter quoted a figure in French francs that Eleanor converted slowly in her head. It was enough. Enough to mean something without being enough to change everything. Enough to be, for the first time in her life, a sum of money that was hers alone. There was also, Marguerite wrote, a collection of paintings. Catherine's paintings. 23 watercolors and 4 oils that Marguerite had kept in her home for years because she could not bear to let them go. She wished now to return them to Catherine's family, if Eleanor would have them. Eleanor sat very still in her armchair for a long time after she finished reading. Her mother had painted in a small room at the back of the Hampshire house with a north-facing window, the way Colette had explained north light worked on the very first Thursday Eleanor had come to the atelier. Her mother had set up her easel beside that window and worked there in the afternoons while the rest of the household carried on around her. Eleanor had been allowed to sit in the corner of the room and watch, which she had done often, quietly, with her knees pulled to her chest and her chin resting on them. She had not known her mother had spent time in Paris. She had not known there had been a friend named Marguerite. She had not known about the paintings that existed in a stranger's house in Paris, 23 watercolors and 4 oils that her mother had made when she was young and free and not yet anyone's wife. She held the letter in her lap and looked out the library window at the bare trees in the street, and felt something she could not quite name. It was not quite grief. It was not quite joy. It was something in between. A fullness and an ache at the same time. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress. She did not tell Charles. This time it was not caution. It was something else. Something more decided. She held the letter and the knowledge it contained, and she felt with great clarity that this was hers, her mother's friend, her mother's paintings, her mother's small inheritance, set aside and kept safe across years and distance. It had nothing to do with the house in Mayfair. It had nothing to do with Lord Ashford's land, or his solicitors, or his dining table, or his opinions about the way she held her cutlery. It was hers. She wrote back to Marguerite Fontaine that evening in the library, at the small writing desk near the window. She wrote in a hand that was careful and measured, because she had been taught that a lady's handwriting should be contained, but she felt, as she wrote, a current of feeling beneath the surface of the careful words. She thanked Marguerite. She said she would be grateful to receive both the sum and the paintings. She asked, as gently as she could, whether Marguerite would tell her more about her mother in Paris, what she had been like, what her days had looked like. She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing post. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed. 23 watercolors, 4 oils. Her mother's work, coming to her. She thought about Colette saying you have a good eye, you see carefully, and she thought about the rooftop painting that she had finally painted with full commitment, the edge that was sharp instead of cautious. She thought about where she had come from and what she had been taught to be and what, perhaps, she had the capacity to become. By February, Eleanor had begun to understand something about paint that she had not expected to understand, which was that it told the truth about the person holding the brush. Not always in obvious ways, not always in ways the painter intended, but the evidence was there in every mark, in the degree of pressure, in the hesitation or the commitment, in the place where the stroke began and the place where it ended, and all the countless small decisions made in between. Colette had been teaching her to see this in the paintings of others. They would stand in front of a canvas, sometimes a work by one of Colette's students, sometimes a reproduction of a painting from a book that Colette kept on a shelf between a jar of turpentine and a cracked earthenware teapot, and Colette would ask her what she saw. Not what the painting depicted, what she saw. Eleanor had begun to understand that she saw a great deal. She could feel, looking at a painting, the places where the painter had been afraid. She could feel the places where something had started honest, and then been corrected away from honesty. She could feel the difference between someone who was painting to impress and someone who was painting to understand. She had come to believe that these two things almost never produced the same results. She thought about this in connection with her own life. She thought about the performance she put on every day, the careful management of herself, the adjustments made in anticipation of Charles's reaction. She thought about how different that was from understanding. She had been performing for so long that she had almost forgotten what understanding herself felt like. The paintings from Paris arrived in March. They came in a large wooden crate, carefully packed, carried into the hallway by two men from the shipping company, while Graves stood nearby with an expression of controlled curiosity. Eleanor had arranged to have them delivered when Charles was away in Yorkshire on business, which gave her 3 days alone with them. She had the crate brought up to her bedroom, and she dismissed Dorothea, who had offered to help, and she unpacked the crate herself. She lifted each painting out with her hands and set it gently on the floor and looked at it before moving to the next one. The watercolors came first. Her mother's name was not on them, but Eleanor knew them immediately and completely, the way you know a voice you have grown up hearing, even after years of silence. Catherine Whitmore had painted with a quality that Eleanor could only describe as generous. The light in her paintings was warm. The colors were not grand or dramatic, but they were alive, and they looked at their subjects with a kind of loving attention, a noticing of things. A watercolor of a market in Paris showed not the dramatic architecture of the buildings but the faces of the people at the stalls, the particular gesture of a woman reaching for fruit, the way a man in a hat was turned slightly towards the light without knowing it. Eleanor set them up around the room, leaning against the walls and the furniture, until the bedroom was full of her mother's Paris. Then she sat on the floor in the middle of them, and looked. She was there for a very long time. She thought about the woman who had made these paintings, young, somewhere in her 20s, in a city she had gone to by choice, with friends and a painting studio and a life that was hers, in a way that Eleanor's life had never been hers. She thought about that young woman coming home to England and marrying a kind but financially troubled gentleman, and raising children in the Hampshire countryside, painting in her north-facing room in the afternoons for the rest of her short life. She had kept painting. That was what Eleanor kept coming back to. Whatever else had changed, whatever accommodations had been made, her mother had kept the painting room. She had kept the brushes and the afternoon light and the private interior life that the painting was an expression of. Eleanor looked around at the 23 watercolors and 4 oils surrounding her on the floor of her bedroom in Mayfair, and felt something clear and simple moving through her. She was not going to disappear. She had been disappearing, slowly, for 4 years. The gray dresses and the careful posture and the minimum of space and the holding of opinions that no one had asked for, the habit of correction before commitment, the smiling at the right moments, the returning home to the library and the books and the long private thoughts that no one would ever hear. She was not going to disappear. She picked up one of the oils. It was a painting of a window from inside a room, the kind of painting that is not really about the window but about the light coming through it, and what that light did to the air of the room, and the quality of the afternoon beyond it. It was the best of the 27 paintings. It was, Eleanor understood, looking at it, simply a very fine painting. She carried it to the window of her own bedroom, and held it up in the afternoon light, and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to her writing desk and wrote a letter to Colette. She did not write much. She wrote that her mother had been a painter. She wrote that she had received a collection of her mother's work. She wrote that she wanted to ask Colette whether she would consider looking at the paintings, and what she thought of them. She sent the letter with the afternoon post. Colette's reply came 2 days later. It said, "Bring them." Eleanor could not bring them all, of course. She selected 4. 3 watercolors and the oil of the window. She wrapped them carefully in cloth and paper and had the carriage take her to Chelsea on Thursday morning, arriving earlier than usual so she and Colette could look at them before the other students arrived. Colette unwrapped each painting slowly and set them against the studio wall and stood back and looked at them in silence. Eleanor stood beside her and waited. The silence went on long enough that Eleanor began to feel slightly anxious, which she knew was irrational but could not help. Then Colette said, "Who was she?" "My mother," Eleanor said. "She studied here in London a little. In Paris for a year when she was young." "Where did she study in Paris?" Eleanor did not know. She said so. Colette moved closer to the oil of the window. She looked at it for a long moment. "This is genuinely good," she said. "This is not skilled amateur work. This is the work of someone who understood what she was doing." She turned to Eleanor. "Did she exhibit?" "I do not know," Eleanor said. "I was 14 when she died. I did not think to ask those questions." Colette looked back at the painting. She should have exhibited. They stood together for a while longer, and then the other students arrived, and the Thursday lesson began. But something had settled in Eleanor that morning, standing in the Chelsea atelier looking at her mother's painting of a window, and the light coming through it. Something had settled and was not going to move. Her mother had been a person that the world had not fully seen. Eleanor was beginning to understand that she was in danger of being the same. She drove home that afternoon and walked into the house and found Charles in the hallway, back a day early from Yorkshire, handing his coat to Graves with the brisk air of a man who had been traveling and was irritated by it. He looked at the package under her arm. "What is that?" he asked. "Paintings," she said, "from my mother's estate." He looked at them with the expression he wore when presented with something that required a response, but that he did not find sufficiently interesting to give a good one. "More things to clutter up the rooms," he said, not unkindly, just carelessly, the way he said most things to her. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She did not say anything. She carried the paintings upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the 3 watercolors she had not brought to Chelsea, which were still arranged against the wall from 2 days ago. And she felt the particular quality of the evening light in the room, and she thought about her mother, and about Colette's voice saying she should have exhibited, and she thought about all the things that the women around her had not done, had not been permitted to do, had not known they were capable of doing. She was 26 years old. She had a library full of books and Thursday mornings in Chelsea, and 27 paintings that belonged to her, and a small sum of money in Paris that was entirely and completely hers. She was not a very great deal, but she was something. And for the first time, she was beginning to take that something seriously. April brought longer light to London, the kind of pale gold evening light that stretched past 7 o'clock and made the city look, briefly, like a place that was less gray than it seemed the rest of the year. The plane trees outside the Mayfair house put out their first small leaves, very green and slightly translucent, catching the light in a way that Eleanor sometimes paused to watch from the drawing-room window. She had been going to Chelsea for 6 months. Her work had changed considerably in that time. Colette remarked on it regularly, with the specific and slightly understated approval that Eleanor had come to understand was Colette's highest form of praise. "You are beginning to trust it," she said one Thursday morning in March, standing behind Eleanor as she worked on a still life of a cloth and a glass, and an old paintbrush laid flat on the table. "You are beginning to believe what you see." Eleanor had started mixing her own colors without assistance. This sounds like a small thing, but it was not. Mixing your own colors meant committing to what you saw, to the exact quality of light and shadow and surface that existed in front of you, rather than choosing from a set of pre-made options. It meant taking responsibility for the accuracy of your perception. It meant trusting that what you saw was real. She had also begun a practice that Colette had suggested, which was to look at a subject for a full 5 minutes before picking up the brush. Just look, take it in, notice the things that surprise you, notice the things that don't match what you expect to see. She had found that this practice, which sounded simple and turned out to be quite demanding, had a quality that extended beyond painting. She had begun to look at things in her daily life with the same quality of attention, to notice the things that didn't match what she expected, to resist the habit of seeing what she had already decided was there. She noticed, for instance, the way the housemaid Agnes carried herself differently when Charles was in the house versus when he was away, slightly smaller, slightly quicker. Eleanor recognized this with a pang that had nothing to do with Agnes specifically. She noticed that Graves, who was formal in all things, had a habit of pausing for just a fraction of a second before responding to Charles's instructions, a pause so small it was invisible unless you were looking for it. But Eleanor, who had learned to look, saw it. She thought it might be the pause of a man swallowing a response that would not be welcome. She noticed that she herself had many such pauses. She had begun, slowly and deliberately, to take them less frequently. It was a Thursday morning in April when Colette said the thing that changed the direction of everything. The lesson was almost over. The other students had finished for the day. And Harriet, the quiet young woman with the extraordinary brushwork, had left quickly because she had a child to collect from somewhere. And Adelaide, the cheerful one who claimed to be bad at painting and clearly wasn't, had stayed to chat for a while and then also left. Eleanor had stayed to work a little longer, as she usually did. She was working on a large canvas that had been occupying her for several weeks. It was not a still life or a landscape or any of the usual subjects. It was something harder to describe. It was a painting of the atelier itself, the long north light coming through the tall windows and falling across the floorboards, the easels in various stages of being in use, the jars of brushes and the stacked canvases and the general organized untidiness of a place where real work was done. It was a painting about the quality of a working space, about the texture of light on a floor that had seen years of paint and turpentine, and people standing in it looking hard at things. She was trying to get the exact color of the afternoon light on the boards near the wall. It was neither warm nor cool. It was both, somehow, simultaneously. Colette came to stand beside her and looked at the painting. She was quiet for a long time, which Eleanor had learned to take as a very good sign. "I would like to ask you something," Colette said eventually. "And I want you to answer honestly, not politely." Eleanor turned to look at her. "I know someone at the Royal Academy," Colette said. "He is on the hanging committee for the autumn exhibition. Not a principal, but a voice that is heard." She paused. "I would like to submit this painting." Eleanor looked at the canvas. It was larger than anything she had made before. It was more ambitious. She had not thought of it as anything other than what it was, work she was doing because she was compelled to do it, and because she had not solved the problem of the light on the floor, and did not want to stop until she had. "I am not finished," she said. "You will be finished," Colette said. "You have 3 months. The question is whether you want it to be seen." The question landed with more weight than Colette probably intended, or perhaps exactly the weight she intended. Eleanor thought about her mother's paintings standing against the walls of her bedroom. She thought about the woman Colette had said should have exhibited. She thought about all the small paintings she had made over the past 6 months that were wrapped in cloth and stored at the back of her wardrobe, because there was no other place to put them that was safe. "The painting would go in under my name?" she asked. Colette tilted her head. "If you like, we can submit it under initials. EA. It is not unusual. Some women prefer it." Eleanor considered this. She thought about what it would mean to send something out into the world that she had made, not under cover of a husband's name or a social occasion or the vague category of ladies' pastime, under her own name, or the initials of it. "EA," she said, as if trying it on. "Yes." She looked at the painting again. The light was still not right near the wall. She still had work to do. "I will think about it," she said. She thought about it for the entire carriage ride home. She thought about it through dinner, while Charles talked about a man named Alderton who had made a poor business decision and was facing consequences. She thought about it in the library afterwards. She thought about it lying in her bed in the dark, looking up at the ceiling while the house settled into its nighttime creaks and groans. She thought about what Charles would say if he knew. She ran through it in her head, the various versions of it, and none of them were comfortable. She thought about what the women at Lady Fitzwilliam's gatherings would say. She thought about the version of herself that had arrived at that gathering 8 months ago and made a polite deflecting response and gone home to the gray dress and the appropriate silence. She thought about the rooftop painting and the edge she had finally made sharp. She thought about her mother in a small room in Hampshire with a north-facing window. She thought about the word exhibit and what it meant. It meant to be seen. It meant to put something into the world and allow the world to look at it and form its own conclusions. It meant relinquishing the safety of invisibility. She was, she realized, tired of invisibility. She had been invisible for long enough that it had started to feel like safety. But safety and freedom were not the same thing, and she had confused them for long enough. The following Thursday she told Colette yes. She said it before she had taken her coat off, while she was still standing in the atelier doorway. Colette looked up from where she was preparing the morning's palettes and said nothing for a moment, and then nodded with the particular Colette nod that meant understood, and returned to the palettes. Eleanor took her coat off and hung it on the hook by the door and went to her easel. She stood in front of the painting for 5 minutes, looking at it. Then she picked up her brush and began to work. She spent the next 8 weeks doing something she had never done before, which was working towards a deadline of her own choosing. Not a social obligation or a household responsibility or something Charles had required. A deadline she had set because she had something she wanted to complete, and she had committed to completing it. She worked on Thursday mornings and sometimes on Friday afternoons when Charles was away, taking the carriage to Chelsea and spending 3 or 4 hours in the atelier, in the concentrated solitude that she had come to love more than almost anything else in her daily life. She was trying to capture something that resisted capture, the quality of light in a working space, which was different from the light in a domestic space or an outdoor space. It was flat but alive. It was neutral but full of color. It was the kind of light that didn't impose itself on what you were looking at, but instead made the looking easier. She made mistakes. She overpainted areas that had been working and had to gently remove layers and begin again. She second-guessed herself on the color of the wall near the left window and repainted it 3 times before finding what she was looking for. She had moments of complete conviction followed by moments of serious doubt, which Colette said was correct and indicated that the painting was doing what it was supposed to do. If you felt completely sure the whole time, Colette said, you would not be making anything worth submitting. Eleanor came to believe this was true of many things, not only painting. She finished it in June. She stood back from it and looked at it for a long time in the afternoon light and knew it was finished in the way that you can sometimes know things without being able to explain them. Something in the painting had resolved. It was not perfect. It had uncertainties in it that she could still see. But the uncertainties were now part of it, not mistakes in it. They were true to what the painting was. She called Colette over. Colette stood in front of it for a full 2 minutes without speaking. Yes, she said. They submitted it to the Royal Academy the following week. It went in as Interior with North Light, by E.A. Eleanor did not tell Charles. She did not tell anyone. She went home from the submission with the same face she always wore and sat at dinner and heard Charles explain at some length why a particular acquaintance had failed in business, and she nodded at the appropriate moments and felt, beneath the surface of all of it, something she had not felt in years. She felt as though she were waiting for something good. The Royal Academy's autumn exhibition opened on the 9th of September in the year 1887, on a Tuesday, with a private view for invited members and associated guests on the Monday evening before. Eleanor was not invited to the private view. She was not invited to anything connected with the exhibition, because no one there knew her name, because the painting had gone in under 2 initials and a title, and that was all. She had not told Charles. She had gone on not telling him through the entire summer, through the months of working and finishing and submitting, through the weeks of waiting that followed. She had settled into the waiting with something that surprised her, which was that it was not entirely uncomfortable. She had thought it would be. She had thought the not knowing would be difficult to carry, but it turned out that the waiting had a quality of possibility in it that she had not felt in a long time, and possibility, even uncertain possibility, was considerably better than the alternative. Charles had been busy through the summer. There was a dispute over the Yorkshire property that had taken up much of his attention and required 2 further trips north and a great many letters and several long evenings with his solicitor, a thin man named Mr. Greaves who wore the same dark coat at every visit and who Eleanor suspected never ate anything. Charles had been absorbed in this business with the concentration he usually reserved for financial matters, which meant he was both more preoccupied than usual and slightly more irritable. He had not asked Eleanor anything about her Thursday mornings. He had not asked her anything about her life in general, with any more than the usual casual inattention. She had moved through the summer in the familiar way, present but unexamined, managing the household and attending the required social occasions, and sitting across the dinner table from a man who looked through her more often than he looked at her. She had found, through the summer, that this bothered her less, not because she had become accustomed to it, but because she had begun to be less dependent on his regard. The painting was finished. The painting had been submitted. The painting was going to be looked at by people who had no idea who had made it, and those people would form their own responses to it, and those responses would have nothing to do with Lord Ashford or the house in Mayfair, or whether Eleanor was holding her cutlery correctly. She went to the Royal Academy on the first Saturday after the exhibition opened. She told Graves she was going out for the afternoon, and took the carriage to Piccadilly, and walked in with the crowds of Saturday visitors. She had not told Colette she was going. She wanted to go alone. The exhibition was large. There were paintings in several rooms, arranged in the Academy's dense and slightly overwhelming manner, frames touching frames up to the height of the walls. Eleanor moved through the first 2 rooms at a pace that was faster than she intended, and she had to consciously slow herself down. She was looking for her painting, but she did not want to find it by rushing. She wanted to find it the way a stranger would find it. She came to it in the 3rd room. It was hung at eye level on the east wall, between a large landscape of the Lake District and a portrait of a gray-haired naval officer. It was the smallest painting in its immediate vicinity, and it did not announce itself. It did not have the sweeping drama of the landscape or the confident authority of the portrait. It was a painting of a working room with north light coming through the windows, and it was quiet, and it asked you to look carefully before it gave itself to you. Eleanor stopped in the entrance to the room and looked at it from a distance. A woman was standing in front of it. The woman was perhaps 35, well-dressed, with a stillness to her that suggested she had been standing there for some time. She was not reading the small card beside the painting. She was just looking at it. Eleanor watched her look at it. After a moment, the woman turned slightly and said something to the man beside her, who was looking at the naval portrait. And he turned and looked at Eleanor's painting with a polite but less engaged expression, and the woman turned back to it and went on looking. Eleanor crossed the room slowly and stood in front of the landscape for a while, looking at the painting from an angle, watching other people's responses. Most people moved past it quickly, but 2 people, in the time she was there, stopped. One was an older man with a cane who stood in front of it with his head tilted slightly, the way you tilt your head when something is asking something of you. The other was a young woman who stopped very abruptly, as if the painting had said her name. Eleanor stood there for a long time. She was watching strangers respond to something she had made in the way they would have responded if the maker had been anyone in the world, without context, without the information that the maker was Lord Ashford's plain wife, without pity or obligation, or the automatic social calibration that came with knowing someone's position. They were responding to the painting itself, and some of them were stopping. She walked home in the gray September afternoon with the particular lightness of someone who has crossed a threshold they did not know they were approaching. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt something quieter and more lasting than either of those things. She felt real. The reviews began to appear in the press in the following week. The Academy exhibition was covered in several papers, and most of the coverage focused on the larger and more prominent works. But in the Morning Post, a critic named Frederick Alderton, who had a reputation for noticing the things others missed, had written a longer piece than usual, and partway through it he mentioned a small painting in the third room that he described as the most quietly compelling work in the exhibition. He had written that the painting had what he called a quality of inhabited attention, a sense that the maker had spent genuine time understanding what they were looking at before attempting to render it. He had written that it managed something rare, which was to make an ordinary space feel full of consequence. He had not identified the maker. The initials offered nothing. He had asked, at the end of the passage, who EA was. He said he would be interested to see more. Eleanor read this review in the library on a Wednesday morning, with a cup of tea going cold beside her. She read it 3 times. Then she set the paper down and sat very still for a moment. Then she went upstairs to her bedroom and opened the wardrobe and looked at the paintings wrapped in cloth at the back of it, behind the summer dresses. She thought about Colette saying she should bring the full collection next time. She thought about her mother in a north-facing room in Hampshire. She thought about the woman who had stood in front of her painting at the Royal Academy for several minutes on a Saturday afternoon, not reading the card, just looking. She went back downstairs to the library and sat in her armchair and picked up the paper again. Frederick Alderton wanted to know who EA was. Eleanor read the question and thought about it for a long time. She was not ready to answer it, not yet. But she was, for the first time in a long time, beginning to think about what answering would look like. What it would mean. What came after. It was Lady Pemberton's winter ball that changed things publicly, though the change itself had been building privately for far longer, the way a river builds before it breaks its banks, quiet and full and inevitable. Eleanor had attended Lady Pemberton's winter ball every year since her marriage, because it was one of those occasions that wives of a certain position attended, the same way they attended the relevant church and the relevant dinners and the relevant afternoon gatherings. It was a large ball, held in the Pemberton House in Grosvenor Square, and it drew a wide cross-section of London society, from the titled, to the merely wealthy, to the successfully interesting. Eleanor had always attended in one of her gray or muted navy dresses, had always stood close to Charles, had always been the woman people looked past when they were looking for someone more relevant to talk to. That year, she did not attend with Charles. The change came about in a simple way. Charles had received, 3 days before the ball, an urgent communication from his solicitor about the Yorkshire property, requiring him to travel north at short notice. He had informed Eleanor of this at dinner with the brisk distraction of a man for whom such changes were a natural consequence of the importance of his affairs. "You may send our apologies to Lady Pemberton," he had said. Eleanor had said nothing for a moment. She had been looking at the candlelight on the surface of her water glass. "I will attend," she said. Charles had looked up, which he did not always do when she spoke. "Alone?" he said. "Lady Pemberton will understand," Eleanor said. It would be rude to send apologies so late. Charles had looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had not anticipated the conversation taking this direction. He had then returned to his dinner and said, As you like. It was as simple as that. And as enormous. She had, over the autumn, spent some of the Paris inheritance carefully, and with intention. She had not spent it on things for the house, or on the social equipment of her position as Lady Ashford. She had spent some of it on art materials. She had spent some of it on books she had wanted for years. And she had spent a small but not insignificant portion of it on a single dress, made by a French dressmaker who had a small establishment on Bond Street, and who was recommended to Eleanor by Colette as someone who made things that suited the person wearing them, rather than the other way around. The dress was deep burgundy, not the ornamental kind of deep color that was fashionable and primarily decorative, a true, settled, grown-up color that had weight to it. The cut was simple and exact. It was not a dress that apologized for being worn. Eleanor had brought it home and hung it in her wardrobe and looked at it occasionally, the way you look at something that is waiting for the right moment. She wore it to Lady Pemberton's winter ball on the 14th of December. She arrived in a cab, not the house carriage, because she had begun to make these small distinctions between the parts of her life, and she wanted this to be a cab. She had 3 canvases, wrapped and carried by a young man she had paid for the purpose, and she walked into the gallery with them and found Francis Ward standing near the back of the room looking at something on the wall with the expression of a person who is not quite finished deciding what they think. She arrived at the Pemberton house and handed her wrap to the waiting staff and walked into the ballroom. Nobody was waiting for her. Nobody had prepared a space for her to stand in. Nobody was watching the door for her arrival. She was simply a woman who walked into a room, and the room received her. She had spent 8 months learning to look at things properly. She had spent 8 months working out how to occupy a space with full attention rather than minimum presence. She had stood in front of canvases and understood how the quality of light changed the quality of everything within it. She knew, walking into that room, exactly how the light was falling. She was not performing confidence. She had not decided to be a different person. She had simply become less willing to perform smallness. There was a difference, and she felt it as she moved across the room to greet Lady Pemberton, who was holding court near the entrance with the jovial authority of a woman who had been hosting this ball for 30 years and enjoyed every minute of it. "My dear Eleanor," Lady Pemberton said warmly, which was more warmth than she usually extended to Charles's quiet wife. "You look very well this evening." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She found a place near the edge of the room where she could see the space and have her back to the wall, as she always did at these events, and she observed. She watched the patterns of the room. She watched who spoke to whom and who moved towards what, and who stood slightly apart with the expression of someone performing engagement without quite having it. She was holding a glass of champagne that she was not particularly drinking, and she was watching a conversation between 2 men near the fireplace about something that involved a hand gesture suggesting ships or markets or possibly both, when a voice beside her said, "You are looking at this room the way a painter looks at a subject." She turned. The man beside her was perhaps 40, with a broad face that had some weather to it, and dark eyes that were currently, she noticed, looking at her with a directness that was neither rude nor entirely comfortable. He had the build of someone who spent time outdoors, and the clothes of someone who also attended the right dinners. He introduced himself as Frederick Harrington, which told her he was the younger son of the Earl of Dunmore, known for having made his own considerable money, in addition to the family's, and for having opinions that not everyone found convenient. "Are you a painter?" he asked. She paused for just a moment. In the usual course of her life, she would have said something modest and deflecting. She would have said something about admiring painting, or something about a friend who painted. "Yes," she said. It was the first time she had said it to someone who had not already known. Harrington looked at her with increased interest. "What do you paint?" "Light, mostly," she said. "The quality of it, how it changes what it falls on." "That's rather a good description of painting generally," he said. "I think the light is the real subject," she said. "The objects in a room are merely where the light decides to rest." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you like to dance?" They danced twice. She found Harrington intelligent and direct and somewhat refreshing in the way that people are refreshing when they say what they actually think without excessive social padding. He asked her questions and listened to the answers, which was not common enough to be unremarkable. When she was not dancing with Harrington, she was, without quite intending it, at the center of a conversation. This also was not usual. Normally, she was at the edges of conversations, a pleasant addition, but not a necessary one. But she had said the thing about light and objects, and it had somehow set a tone, and Harrington had introduced her to someone, and that person had introduced her to someone else, and by 11 o'clock she had had 3 conversations that she would not have predicted, and 2 of them had been genuinely interesting. The Duke of Harwick asked her to dance, which surprised her considerably. He was an older man, perhaps 55, with the slightly distant manner of someone who spent most of his social energy deciding whether the room he was in was worth his time. He danced well and spoke with precision, and he asked her who she was, and when she said Lady Ashford, she saw his eyebrows move slightly, not in recognition but in something closer to recalibration. "I have not heard Lord Ashford mention that his wife painted," he said. "Lord Ashford is not aware of it," Eleanor said. Harwick looked at her with the careful attention of a man who had heard many things in many drawing rooms and had learned to recognize when something was worth attending to. "He should be," he said. She was in the carriage at midnight, and she sat in it on the way home with her hands folded in her lap and the cold December air coming slightly through the window, and she looked out at the street lamps going past, and she thought about the evening. She had been seen, not as Lord Ashford's quiet wife, not as the woman people looked past while looking for someone more relevant. She had been seen as a person, as herself. And the thing she had said, the thing about light and objects, had not been a performance. It was what she actually thought. She had been telling the truth, as she always did when she was thinking about painting, and the truth had turned out to be more interesting to people than the careful approximation of a person she had been presenting for 4 years. She let herself into the house quietly. The hallway was lit with a single lamp. Graves had left the door unbolted. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the burgundy dress, not quite ready to change out of it yet, and looked at the painting of the window that was propped on the dresser, the one that had come from Paris with her mother's things. She thought about Marguerite Fontaine's letter and the words she had used about Catherine. Gifted. Deserved more recognition. She thought about Frederick Alderton in the Morning Post, asking who EA was. She thought about the Duke of Harwick saying he should be. She sat with all of it for a while. Then she changed her clothes and got into bed and lay in the dark and thought about what came next. Not as an abstract idea, not as a distant possibility, as something she was actually going to move towards. She fell asleep thinking about the color of light in the 3rd room at the Royal Academy, and how she might paint it, and what she would call the painting. Charles heard about the ball before Eleanor told him about it, which was not surprising, because London's social information moved with the efficiency of a well-organized postal service, and the information it carried was considerably more interesting. He heard about it from a man named Percival Holt at his club, on the Thursday after the ball. Percival Holt was an acquaintance rather than a friend, a man who existed in the same social circles as Charles, and who was known for having an excellent memory for things that had happened at other people's events. Percival mentioned, in the context of a broader conversation about the Pemberton ball, that Charles's wife had been rather the talk of the evening. Charles had looked at him. She had a conversation about painting with Harrington that apparently went on rather a while, Percival said, and Harwick danced with her. Harwick, Charles repeated. Asked her twice, Percival said, which was not accurate but was the version that had reached him. And she said something at the beginning of the evening that several people seemed to have repeated. What did she say? Percival thought for a moment. Something about light, the light being the real subject and objects merely being where it rests. Charles said nothing for a moment. My wife, he said. Your wife, Percival confirmed, pleasantly, without apparent awareness of the complexity of the moment. Charles came home from his club that evening with the expression he wore when he had been given information that required him to rearrange something in his understanding. Eleanor was in the drawing room when he arrived, reading by the fire, which she had taken to doing in the evenings because the drawing room fire was better than the library fire, and because she had decided to make use of the drawing room since she had spent 4 years allowing it to feel like his. He stood in the doorway. Harwick danced with you, he said. She looked up from her book. He did. The Duke of Harwick. Yes. Charles came into the room and sat in the chair across from her, which he did not usually do in the evenings. Usually he went directly to his study. I did not know you were interested in painting, he said. She looked at him steadily. You never asked. The silence that followed this was the specific quality of silence that comes when someone has said a true thing that cannot be usefully argued with. Charles was not a stupid man. He recognized this kind of silence. He sat in it for a moment. Harrington too, apparently, he said. We talked about painting, Eleanor said. What do you know about painting? She held his gaze. Quite a lot, as it happens. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who was looking at something, and finding it slightly different from what he had believed it to be. Not dramatically different, not transformed, just not what he had decided it was. I see, he said. He did not say anything after that. He stood and went to his study. Eleanor returned to her book, but she was not really reading. She was sitting with the conversation, feeling its weight. He had not known she was interested in painting because he had never asked. She had been reading about painting and thinking about painting and going to Chelsea every Thursday and making things that a critic in the Morning Post had described as the most quietly compelling work in the exhibition, and he had not known because the idea that his quiet, plain wife might have an interior life had simply not occurred to him. She thought about how many versions of this there were, how many people were known only by the surface that other people had decided to look at. She went upstairs to her bedroom and took out a sheet of paper and began making notes. Not the careful household notes she made in her household book, different notes, notes about what she was thinking, about what she wanted to make next, about the light in a large public room and how it was different from the light in a working space, and whether that difference was paintable. She filled 2 pages before she put the paper away. Charles brought up the ball twice more in the following days, in ways that were not quite questions and not quite comments. He mentioned that Lady Pemberton had spoken highly of Eleanor to someone he had met. He mentioned that Harrington was known to have strong opinions about art. He said nothing that was a direct acknowledgement of anything, because he was not a man who found direct acknowledgements comfortable, but he was circling something. On the Saturday, he surprised her at breakfast by saying, unexpectedly and with the slight awkwardness of a man attempting an unfamiliar type of sentence, "I should like to hear about the painting." She set down her teacup. "Which painting?" she said. "Your painting. The one at the Academy. I heard about it from Greves, who heard it from someone on the committee." The quiet she felt at this was deep and several layered. He had known about the painting. He had found out through his own channels, in his own world, through the network of information that moved through men's clubs and business dinners. He had found out that his wife had made something that was in the Royal Academy and had been written about in the Morning Post. He had found out through other people before she had chosen to tell him. "Interior with North Light," she said. "By E.A., he said. "Yes. E stands for Eleanor." "It does." He looked at her across the breakfast table, and it was one of the few times in their marriage that she felt he was actually looking at her, not past her, not through her, not at the social function of her, at her. "Why did you not tell me?" he said. She thought about this. She thought about the real answer, which was complex and not particularly comfortable, and the polite answer, which was simple and not particularly true, and she made a decision about which one to give. "Because I did not think you would be interested," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That is fair," he said. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She picked up her teacup again and looked at the window, and outside the plane trees were bare against the gray winter sky, and she thought about April and the small green leaves, and the quality of the light then, and how she might paint it. She was not going to forgive him quickly. She was not sure she was going to forgive him at all. Forgiveness was a separate matter from what was happening now, and she was not prepared to pretend they were the same. But something had shifted in the house. Something had moved, as things move when they have been held too long in one position. She drank her tea. She thought about her painting. She thought about Colette's face when she had finished the atelier canvas, the long silence before the single yes. She thought about what Frederick Alderton had written. "Who is E.A.? Not yet," she thought. She was not ready yet. But she was thinking about it. The conversation with Charles at breakfast was not the beginning of something. Eleanor was careful not to mistake it for that. It was a moment of honesty in the middle of a marriage that had been built on very little honesty, and honesty in a moment does not automatically create a pattern. She had lived in this house for long enough to know that patterns were made of many moments, repeated and reinforced, and a single conversation across the breakfast table, however unexpectedly genuine, was just one data point. She went to Chelsea that Thursday with a new canvas and a particular problem she wanted to solve, which was how to paint the quality of winter light in a large public room without making it feel cold. She had been thinking about the Pemberton ball and the way the candlelight had moved across the surface of the room, the way it caught the edges of things and made the spaces between people soft and golden. She wanted to paint something in that space between candlelight and conversation, where the social surface of an evening became something else, something more human and more fragile. Colette looked at her preliminary sketches without comment for a long time. "This is new," she said finally. "I was at a ball," Eleanor said. "I was watching the light." "You were watching people," Colette said. "The light on people." Colette smiled, which she did rarely, and which always felt like a particular compliment when she did. Eleanor worked that morning with the focused energy of someone who had a lot they wanted to understand. She made mistakes she was not troubled by, because the mistakes told her things. She began to feel that she was not just painting light, but trying to understand something about visibility, about being seen and seeing. about what the light reveals when it falls on a person who has been in shadow for a long time. She stayed later than usual. When she finally put down her brush and cleaned up, Colette was on the other side of the studio writing letters at her desk, a task she said she saved for the end of the day when the creative energy had been used up. "Colette," Eleanor said. Colette looked up. "I want you to tell me about the submission process," Eleanor said. "Not the academy. Other exhibitions. What else is there?" Colette set down her pen. She looked at Eleanor with the direct, assessing look that Eleanor had come to understand meant she was being taken seriously. "There are the smaller galleries," Colette said. "There are several that take new work, the Grosvenor, though it is perhaps not your direction. There are galleries in Chelsea itself, 2 or 3. There is a woman who runs a gallery in Bloomsbury who shows women's work specifically, and she is serious. She does not show things merely because women made them." "What is her name?" "Frances Ward." "I would like an introduction." Colette nodded slowly. "You are ready," she said. It was not a question. "I think I am," Eleanor said. She drove home in the January dusk and walked into the house to find Charles in the hallway with a man Eleanor recognized as the solicitor Greaves, both of them in their coats, evidently having just arrived. Charles looked at her and said, "We are going to need the study for an hour." This was a version of a sentence she had heard many times, always phrased as though she might have had a competing claim on the room, which she never had. "Of course," she said, and started towards the staircase. "Eleanor," Charles said. She stopped. "There is a letter for you. From Paris. Graves left it in the library." She thanked him and went to the library and found the letter on the table beside her usual chair. It was from Marguerite Fontaine. She had been writing back and forth with Marguerite since the autumn, long letters in which Marguerite told her about Paris, and about the years when she had known Catherine, and about the small painting circle they had been part of, a group of young women who had studied together and supported each other's work, with the serious intent of people who understood they were doing something the world was not particularly prepared to support. This letter was longer than usual. Marguerite had written that she was coming to London in February on a visit she had been planning for some time, and she wanted very much to meet Eleanor. She also wrote that she had, in her careful keeping over the years, one more thing that belonged to Eleanor, a sketchbook, Catherine's sketchbook from the Paris year, filled with preliminary studies and notes about what she was looking at and why. She had been reluctant to send it through the post and wanted to bring it herself. Eleanor read the letter twice. A sketchbook, notes about what she was looking at and why. She sat in the library for a long time. Outside the window, the January street was quiet, and the lamp in the hallway cast its light along the corridor, and the house was full of the muffled sound of Charles and his solicitor discussing something serious in the study. And Eleanor held Marguerite's letter and thought about her mother's handwriting, which she had not seen since she was 14 years old. She was going to see it in February. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and sat for a while longer in the library chair, with the reading lamp making its pool of yellow light, and she thought about all the things that were moving towards her, all the things she had set in motion over the past months, all the quiet and determined work of becoming more fully herself. She thought about the gallery in Bloomsbury, Frances Ward. She thought about introducing herself and what she would say when she did. She thought about the sketchbook. She thought about the rooftop painting with the sharp edge, about the atelier canvas in the Royal Academy, about the woman who had stood in front of it on a Saturday afternoon, not reading the card, just looking. She thought about all the people who had looked and seen only plainness, and all the things that had existed beneath that surface the entire time, waiting, patient, entirely itself. She was not a woman who had transformed. She was a woman who had been, all along, exactly this. The world had simply not had the occasion to find out. In February, Marguerite Fontaine arrived. Marguerite Fontaine was a small woman, with silver hair and the quick movements of someone who had spent a lifetime moving through crowded rooms with purpose. She arrived at Eleanor's door on a Thursday morning in the second week of February, which Eleanor had chosen deliberately so that they could go directly to Chelsea afterwards if Marguerite wanted to see her work. Eleanor had told Charles that a friend of her mother's was coming to visit. He had nodded with mild interest and gone to his club. This was fine. This was, Eleanor had decided, consistently fine. Marguerite came into the hall and stopped and looked at Eleanor and said, in English with a strong French sound to it, "You look like her." Eleanor had not expected this. She stood very still for a moment. "Come in," she said. They sat in the drawing room, which Eleanor had made comfortable with flowers and a good fire, and Eleanor poured tea, and Marguerite sat across from her and looked at her with the particular intensity of a woman who has been holding on to something valuable for a long time and is finally in the presence of the right person to give it to. She had brought the sketchbook wrapped in a cloth bag, which she placed on the table between them without comment. They talked for a long time before Eleanor picked it up. They talked about Paris in the early years of the decade, when Catherine had been there and the city had had a quality, Marguerite said, that was hard to describe, but that everyone who had been there at that particular time described in similar ways. They talked about the painting circle, which had consisted of 7 young women, most of them English and 1 Irish, and one who had come all the way from America to study in Paris, which in those days required a particular kind of determination. Eleanor asked what her mother had been like in those years. Marguerite thought about this carefully. The way you think about things you want to get right. She was serious.
She said.
Not in the way of being without humor. She laughed very easily. But she was serious about the work. She was the one in our circle who worked longest and asked the hardest questions and did not accept comfortable answers. She had a standard for herself that was genuinely high, and she met it, which is rarer than it sounds. Eleanor listened. She went home because her father was not well, Marguerite said. And then there was your father, who was kind. And then there were children, and then the years went by the way years go. She wrote to me regularly until she died. She paused. She wrote about you. Eleanor looked at her. About all of her children, but about you specifically, Marguerite said. She said you had her eyes, not the color, the way of using them. Eleanor felt the particular quality of this in her chest, the specific weight of being seen by someone who was no longer there to see you. She picked up the sketchbook. It was a small hardcover book, slightly worn at the corners, with a clasp that opened with a small resistance as if it had not been opened in a long time. She opened it. Her mother's handwriting. Small and precise and clear, running alongside sketch after sketch after sketch, quick drawings of the Paris streets and the people in them and the interiors of the rooms where they worked, and beside each one notes about what she was looking at, why the angle was interesting, what the light was doing, why she had decided to look at this and not that. Eleanor turned the pages slowly. She stopped at a sketch of a window, a room with a tall window and the light coming through it, in a way that changed the quality of the air inside the room. Beside it her mother had written, in small neat letters, "The light is the subject. Everything else is only where it decides to rest." Eleanor sat very still. She read it again. "The light is the subject. Everything else is only where it decides to rest." She thought about what she had said to Frederick Harrington at Lady Pemberton's ball, on a December evening, when she had not been thinking about what to say but had simply said the thing she actually believed. The objects in a room are merely where the light decides to rest. She had not read this before. She had not known her mother had written it. She had arrived at the same conclusion through her own observation, through her own months of learning to see, through her own process of understanding how light worked. She looked at Marguerite. "She wrote this," Eleanor said. Marguerite looked at the page. "Yes. And I said almost exactly this to someone a few weeks ago. I did not know she had written it." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am not surprised." Eleanor looked at the sketchbook and then at Marguerite and then out the drawing room window at the February street, where the plane trees were still bare but had in them somewhere the possibility of April. "I have been painting," Eleanor said. "I know," Marguerite said. "Colette wrote to me. We have known each other for some years." Eleanor absorbed this. "She said you were genuinely good," Marguerite said simply. "Colette does not say this about people unless she means it." Eleanor looked at her hands, which were clean at the moment but which had spent most of the past 8 months with some trace of paint on them if you looked closely. She thought about the painting in the Royal Academy. She thought about Frederick Alderton's review. She thought about Francis Ward in Bloomsbury. She thought about all the things she had not known she was capable of until she had tried them. "I want to show more work," she said. "I want to be known as a painter." "Not as Lord Ashford's wife," Marguerite said. "Not as that," Eleanor said. "Or not only as that." Marguerite looked at her for a long moment, the way people look when they are deciding whether someone means what they are saying. "Good," she said. "Then let us go to Chelsea and I will tell you what I think of what you have made." They went to Chelsea. Colette was there, and there was a particular quality to the 2 women in the studio together. Colette French and practical and direct, Marguerite French and full of her own history with Catherine, the history of serious women and serious work, and the years in Paris when anything had seemed possible. Eleanor showed them her work. Not just the Thursday morning studies. She had brought several canvases from the house, wrapped and carried in the carriage, including the rooftop painting with the sharp edge, and a study of the library at home that she had made in the autumn, trying to capture what that room felt like from the inside. They looked at everything without speaking for a long time. Then Marguerite said, You should write to Francis Ward. I know, Eleanor said. Today, Marguerite said. Eleanor looked at her. She looked at Colette, who gave her the small particular nod. She took out the piece of paper that she had brought in her bag for this specific reason, because she had already known, coming here this morning, that this was the conversation she was going to have. She wrote the letter to Francis Ward at the small table in the corner of the Chelsea atelier, with February light coming through the north windows, and Marguerite and Colette talking quietly on the other side of the room. Two women who had known each other for decades, and who spoke with the ease of people who have been through enough of life together to have nothing left to perform. She addressed the letter. She sealed it. She handed it to Colette to post. Then she went back to her easel and looked at the unfinished canvas on it, the large painting of the winter light at Pemberton's ball, the candlelight and the conversation, and the people in the spaces between. She picked up her brush. She began. Francis Ward's gallery in Bloomsbury was on a narrow street that seemed too small for what it contained. From the outside it was unremarkable, a ground floor space with two large windows showing a single painting each, both of them things that made you want to cross the street to look more carefully. Inside it was long and well lit, with high ceilings and walls painted a deep warm white that was not quite cream and not quite gray, and that made the paintings hang in a quality of light that seemed to come from within them. Eleanor had been there twice before, once out of curiosity, after Colette had mentioned Francis Ward, and once a week after the first visit, because she had not been able to stop thinking about what she had seen there. She had stood in front of several of the paintings for long minutes, not because they were the most technically impressive things she had seen, but because they were honest. They were paintings made by people who had genuinely looked at something and had the courage to put down exactly what they saw, without apology. She had written the letter from the Chelsea atelier and had received a reply within the week, because Francis Ward turned out to be a person who dealt with things promptly. The reply was short and direct, and invited Eleanor to come to the gallery on the second Tuesday of March at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, bringing whatever work she wished to show. She arrived in a cab, not the house carriage, because she had begun to make these small distinctions between the parts of her life, and she wanted this to be a cab. She had 3 canvases wrapped and carried carefully, and she walked into the gallery, and found Francis Ward standing near the back of the room looking at something on the wall with the expression of a person who was not quite finished deciding what she thought. Francis Ward was perhaps 50. She was tall and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had been a painter herself in earlier years, and still had it in her body. She shook Eleanor's hand without preamble, and looked at her with the directness that Eleanor had come to associate with people who worked seriously in art, as though they had used up their tolerance for surface behavior in other areas of life. "Unwrap them," she said. Eleanor unwrapped them. She had brought 3. The rooftop painting with the sharp edge, the library study, and the large atelier canvas that had been in the Royal Academy. Francis Ward stood back and looked at all 3 for a considerable time without speaking. Eleanor stood to the side, not quite able to make herself stand in front of the paintings alongside Francis Ward, because the evaluation felt too direct, too much like being assessed oneself, which, she supposed, was exactly what it was. Francis Ward moved from one canvas to the next. She stood in front of the atelier painting for the longest time. She crouched slightly to look at the lower portion of it. She stepped back. She moved close again. Then she straightened and turned to Eleanor. "The one at the Academy," she said. "Interior with north light. That was yours." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Alderton was right," Francis said. "I was at the exhibition. I saw it." Eleanor held this for a moment. "Why initials?" Francis asked. "I was cautious," Eleanor said. "And now?" Eleanor thought about Marguerite Fontaine's letter arriving in the hallway. She thought about the sketchbook and her mother's handwriting, and the thing about light and where it decides to rest. She thought about the woman at the Pemberton ball who had said she looked like her mother, not in her face but in the way she used her eyes. "Less so," she said. Francis Ward looked at the atelier canvas again. "I want to show this," she said. "And I want 2 more, whatever is closest to done." She named a date 6 weeks away. A small exhibition, 5 artists. The theme is working spaces, which this fits. You would be the only English woman in the show, and the only one without a previous exhibition history. "I understand," Eleanor said. "I am not concerned about that," Francis said. "I am only telling you so you understand what you are stepping into." Eleanor looked at the atelier canvas, the painting she had made over 8 weeks of Thursday mornings, the painting of the north light on the wooden floor, the quality of inhabited attention. "I understand," she said again. "What are the dates?" She drove home with the 3 canvases and a date written in her notebook, and the particular feeling of having put something into motion that could not now be taken back. She was not frightened, or not only frightened. She was the kind of frightened that sits very close to excitement, the kind that comes when you are doing something real. She told Charles that evening at dinner. She had decided to tell him. Not because she needed his approval, which she had stopped waiting for some months ago, but because she had also stopped wanting to keep things from him as a form of self-protection. She was no longer in the position of needing to protect herself in that way. She was in the position of being able to simply say what she was doing, as a person is entitled to do. "I am going to have a painting in an exhibition at a gallery in Bloomsbury," she said, in April. Charles looked up from his dinner. "A small exhibition," she said. "5 artists. The gallery is run by a woman named Frances Ward who has a serious reputation." Charles set down his fork. He looked at her. The look was the look she had begun to see more often in the past months, the look of recalibration, of noticing something in the view that had previously been missed. "I see," he said. "I wanted you to know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Should I come to the opening?" She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "if you like." He came to the opening. He stood in the Frances Ward Gallery on an April evening with the warmth of spring just beginning to come through the open door, and he looked at Eleanor's paintings, 3 of them now, including the Atelier canvas and the Pemberton Ball painting, and a new one she had made in the week since, a painting of the drawing room at home in the early morning light before anyone was in it. He stood in front of the drawing room painting for a long time. Eleanor watched him from across the gallery, where she was in conversation with a journalist from a magazine that covered the arts, a woman named Georgina Hartley who had already asked her 3 good questions and was in the middle of a 4th. She watched Charles look at the painting of the room they both lived in, the room she had painted at 6 o'clock in the morning, when the winter light came through the curtains in long horizontal lines, and made everything in it look both familiar and entirely new. She had painted the room as she saw it. She had not softened the edge. She turned back to Georgina Hartley and answered the 4th question. "What do you want people to take away from the work?" Georgina had asked. Eleanor thought about it. She thought about all the things she had been thinking for the past year, and she thought about the right way to say the most important of them. "I want people to look more carefully at ordinary things," she said. "Not because the ordinary things are secretly extraordinary, but because they are genuinely themselves, which is already enough. Most of us spend our lives looking past the surfaces of things, deciding in advance what they are. I am trying to persuade people to stop deciding and start looking." Georgina wrote this down. Across the gallery, Charles moved from the drawing room painting to the Atelier canvas and stood in front of it. Eleanor did not watch to see his expression. She had stopped needing to. There is a particular quality to the spring in London that arrives without warning, usually on a day in late March or early April, when you have resigned yourself to the gray continuance of winter and then you step outside and the air is different, lighter, full of a moisture that is warm rather than cold. The plane trees on the Mayfair street had been bare for months, and then one morning Eleanor looked out the drawing room window and saw the first small leaves unfurling on the branches, very green and slightly translucent in the morning light, and she stood at the window for a long time looking at them. She thought about painting them. She thought about the quality of new leaves in morning light, the way they were both opaque and luminous at the same time, the way the light went through them rather than simply landing on them. She had been thinking this way for a year now. She had been moving through the world with the particular attention of someone who is always slightly looking for the next painting, always half present in the actual scene and half present in the potential image of it. Colette had warned her about this. "You must be careful," she had said, "not to live at one remove from your own life, always translating the living into painting. The painting must come from the living, not replace it." Eleanor had taken this seriously. She had tried, in the months since, to be more fully in things. To be at dinner as a person at dinner, not as a painter cataloging the quality of the candlelight. To walk in the street as someone walking, not as someone compiling visual notes. It was a practice that required the same deliberate attention that painting itself required, which she supposed was the point. The April exhibition at Frances Ward's gallery had brought things into the open in a way that the Royal Academy submission had not, because the Royal Academy piece had been initials and a title and a wall in a large institution. The Bloomsbury exhibition was smaller and more intimate, and her name was on the card, her full name, and the card said painter next to it, in a way that she had not expected to feel as settled as it did, as though the word had been waiting for the right occasion to become simply true. The opening had brought 40 people into the gallery in the course of an evening, which Frances said was a respectable number for a first showing. Several of them had stood in front of Eleanor's atelier canvas for long periods, including 2 men that Frances identified as collectors who were known for making considered rather than fashionable choices. Georgina Hartley's piece about the exhibition appeared in a weekly magazine with a circulation that Frances described, without drama, as the right readership. Georgina had quoted Eleanor on looking carefully at ordinary things and not deciding in advance what they are. Several people wrote to the gallery to say they had found it interesting. Frances forwarded the letters. Eleanor read them in the library. She was in the middle of reading one of them, from a woman in Kensington who had said that the sentence about deciding in advance had made her think differently about something she would not have predicted, when Charles came to the library door and said that a man named the Duke of Harwick was calling. She looked up from the letter. "He asked for you specifically," Charles said. She set the letter down. She stood up and smoothed her dress and walked to the drawing room. The Duke of Harwick was standing near the fireplace when she entered, and he looked at her with the same recalibrating expression she had seen at the ball in December, but with something additional in it now, something that was not quite surprise and was closer to confirmation. "Lady Ashford," he said, "I was at the Bloomsbury Gallery last week. I hope you found something of interest," she said. "I found your work of very considerable interest," he said. "The ball painting particularly. I was at Pemberton's ball, as it happens, and I have been at many such evenings and have never thought about what the light was doing." "Most people don't," she said. "They should," he said, and it was almost exactly what he had said to Charles in December, and he seemed to know it, because the corner of his mouth moved. "I am on the board of a foundation that commissions work for public spaces," he said, "not portraits, not monuments. Things that people will walk past every day, and that will make them see something they would otherwise miss. I have been looking for someone who can paint space in a way that changes how people feel in it." Eleanor looked at him. "I would like to discuss a commission," he said. She held the silence for a moment. "I would be glad to discuss it," she said. After Harwick had gone, she went back to the library and sat in her armchair and looked out the window at the plane trees, with their new leaves catching the spring light. She sat there for quite a long time. Charles appeared in the doorway. "What did Harwick want?" he said. "He wants to offer me a commission," she said. Another recalibration. She watched it happen. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from hers, which he had begun doing more often since December. The space between them was not warm. It was not what she had imagined a marriage might be, back when she had been 22 and determined to make the best of things. But it had a honesty to it now that it had lacked before, which was something. "A commission," he said. "For a public building," she said. "A painting for a space where many people will walk past it." He looked at her. The look had changed since the beginning of this. At the beginning she had been a piece of the house, part of the background, managed and passed by. The look now had in it something she had not expected, something that was genuinely uncertain, the look of a man who has found himself in terrain he did not prepare for, and is not sure of the ground. "I told you were plain," he said. The directness of this was more surprising than the content, which she had been living with for years. "You did," she said. "I was wrong," he said. It was not an apology, it was a statement of fact. She recognized the difference and chose not to close the gap between them artificially. An apology would have required more from him and would have required her to respond to it, and she was not prepared to do either of those things yet, or perhaps ever, in a way that was straightforward. "I know," she said. They sat in the library in the April afternoon, with the new leaves on the trees outside the window, and the letters on the table, and the commission sitting in the room between them like something that needed time to find its proper place. She was not finished. She was, she understood, very far from finished. There was the commission to discuss, and the second exhibition that Frances Ward had already proposed, and the sketchbook of her mother's notes that she returned to regularly, finding things in it that she had not seen on the previous reading. Her mother's thoughts about color and form and the quality of working in a particular light, speaking to her, across the years, as directly as a letter. She was not the woman she had been a year ago. She was, she thought, closer to the woman she had been before that, before the gray dresses and the correct posture, and the careful management of her own visibility. Before she had learned to make herself plain, she had not transformed. She wanted to be clear about this, at least with herself. You could not transform what was already there. You could only clear away what had been placed over it, the habits of smallness and the expectations of others, and the long practice of anticipating disapproval and incorporating it in advance. She had cleared some of that away. She was still clearing it. It was work that did not have a finish line, but she was doing it. She was at the window now, looking at the plane trees in the April light, and behind her in the library Charles was still sitting in his chair across from hers, and in Chelsea Colette was probably in her atelier in the afternoon north light, and in Bloomsbury Frances Ward was probably looking at something on a wall with the expression of a person who was not quite finished deciding, and somewhere in Edinburgh Clara was probably writing another long, warm letter that would arrive in a few days and ask how she was, really. She was going to write back and tell her. For the first time in a long time, she was going to write back and tell her the truth. She was well. She was more than well. She was building something, quietly and deliberately, the way good things are built, without announcing it, without asking anyone's permission, without waiting for the world to decide she was worthy of it. She was painting the light. And the light, as she had come to understand, would fall on whatever it found worth illuminating. She picked up her brush.